Hey, everyone! Noah here. The old alliances are cracking. Tonight, a quiet rebellion is spreading across the Pacific, and it began not with a treaty or a troop movement, but with a simple invitation. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has just extended a historic offer. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney will address the Australian Parliament in March. This is not a diplomatic courtesy visit. It is a public, powerful, and deliberate signal. The world's middle powers, nations tired of being economic pawns in games played by superpowers, are starting to unite. And in doing so, Australia has just broken step with America, choosing a new partner to navigate a dangerous world. For decades, the global order was simple. Great powers led, and everyone else followed. America set the agenda, and its allies, including Canada and Australia, fell in line. They were junior partners in an alliance built on protection and patronage. But that era is ending. The trigger was a speech in the Swiss Alps. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Mark Carney stood before the global elite and did something extraordinary. He didn't just praise cooperation, he declared independence. He argued that the so-called rules-based order was collapsing, not by accident, but because the great powers themselves, particularly an America led by Donald Trump, were turning economic relationships into weapons. Tariffs were no longer just policy tools. They were leverage to force compliance. Carney called on the world's middle powers, countries like Canada, Australia, Mexico, South Korea, and Indonesia, to wake up. He said they must stop waiting for permission from Washington or Beijing. They must recognize their own collective strength, coordinate with each other, and build a new network of cooperation to protect themselves from economic coercion. The financial press initially shrugged. Another lofty speech from a thoughtful leader. Just words. They were wrong. Those words were a blueprint. And on January 25th, in Sydney, Australia became the first nation to pick up that blueprint and start building. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese stepped before the cameras of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. With a tone of firm resolve, he made his announcement. My friend Mark Carney will visit Australia to address the Parliament in March. Then came the line that transformed a visit into a manifesto. I agree with him. 3 words that echoed from Sydney to Ottawa to Washington. Translation: Australia is no longer content to be a passive ally. It endorses Canada's radical vision. The middle power thesis is no longer theory. It is now operational policy. This is the story of how a speech in Davos became a diplomatic earthquake, how Donald Trump's threats of tariffs against allies created the very unity he sought to prevent, and how 2 traditional American allies, Canada and Australia, are now quietly drawing the plans for a new global architecture where middle powers finally write their own rules. To understand the shock of this moment, you must understand what a parliamentary address means. In the theater of international diplomacy, not all visits are created equal. A leader can meet for private talks. They can give a speech at a university. But an invitation to address the full parliament, the elected heart of a nation, is reserved for those whose ideas carry profound weight. It is a platform of supreme symbolic importance. By offering this platform to Carney, Albanese is doing more than welcoming a fellow leader. He is amplifying Carney's message to the entire Australian political establishment and broadcasting Australia's alignment with it to the world. The timing is a masterstroke. March 2026 places the visit just months after the Davos speech, ensuring the ideas are fresh and the momentum is unbroken, all while Trump continues to rattle the global system with new threats. But this is not a sudden decision. It is the latest move in a calculated strategy. Connect the dots. In October of the previous year, Canada and Australia signed a major agreement to deepen cooperation on critical minerals, the rare metals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel that power everything from electric vehicles to advanced weapons. This is the exact sector where both nations feel immense pressure. They possess the resources China desperately needs for its manufacturing dominance, yet they fear Beijing's economic coercion. They are supposed to be secure allies of the United States, yet they face Trump's capricious tariff threats. The critical minerals deal was the first quiet brick in a new foundation. Carney's Davos speech was the architectural plan, and now, the Australian parliamentary invitation is the grand unveiling of the structure. This is sequential, deliberate strategy in action. Why would Australia, a nation with deep historical and security ties to America, make such a bold move? Because the pressures on Canberra are a mirror image of the pressures on Ottawa. Australia is a continent-sized nation isolated by vast oceans. Its economy is deeply dependent on volatile trade with China. It relies on American security guarantees but watches as the United States, under Trump, treats alliances as transactional burdens. Like Canada, Australia is what strategists call a middle power, too large and resource-rich to be ignored, but not large enough to single-handedly defy a superpower. Alone, each is vulnerable. Together, they start to form a counterweight. Carney's speech gave voice to a silent consensus growing in capitals from Seoul to Brasilia to Mexico City. Leaders of capable sovereign nations were growing weary of a binary choice: bow to American pressure or bend to Chinese influence. When Carney articulated this frustration as a call for collective action, he didn't create a new idea. He gave it a name and a champion. The reaction from other middle powers was immediate and telling. Mexico's leadership, led by President Claudia Sheinbaum, publicly expressed appreciation for Carney's important message. South Korean and Indonesian officials privately relayed their agreement. The speech struck a nerve because it described a reality they were all living. Donald Trump understood the threat immediately. He criticized Carney's Davos address not because it was poorly argued, but because he recognized its power. It was a direct challenge to his core tactic of using America's economic dominance to bully allies into submission. Trump's playbook relies on dealing with nations one by one, isolating them, and forcing them to capitulate. Carney's vision of a united front of middle powers shatters that playbook. You cannot threaten Canada with auto tariffs if Australia, Mexico, and South Korea are standing alongside Ottawa, ready to form a new trade bloc without you. What we are witnessing now are the first tentative steps to build that united front. Carney has positioned Canada as the intellectual and strategic leader of this movement. Australia has now become the first committed partner, moving from whispered agreement to public commitment. Mexico is signaling strong interest. These are not random, isolated friendships. They are the initial nodes in a new network, a web of cooperation designed explicitly to increase sovereignty and reduce vulnerability. For generations, the world's institutional architecture was built for and by great powers. The G7 is a club of wealthy, powerful nations where America's voice is dominant. The G20 is too large and includes too many conflicting interests for decisive action. Middle powers have always been relegated to the audience, forced to adapt to agendas set in Washington or Beijing. Carney's vision, now being tested by the Australia Partnership, suggests a new possibility. An M50, a formal coalition of perhaps 50 significant middle power nations from every continent, places like Canada, Australia, Mexico, South Korea, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, and Turkey. This would not be a military alliance like NATO. It would be a strategic and economic coordination forum, headquartered somewhere neutral like Singapore or indeed in Canada itself, designed for one purpose: to allow these nations to set their own collective agenda. Imagine the possibilities. On critical minerals, instead of competing against each other for Chinese favor or living in fear of American sanctions, these nations could coordinate their policies. Canada and Australia have the lithium, South Africa has the platinum, Brazil has the rare earths, Indonesia has the nickel. Together, they could establish their own secure supply chains, set fair global prices, and build processing capacity, breaking the monopolies that currently give great powers their leverage. On trade, they could negotiate agreements among themselves, creating resilient, diversified markets that reduce their dangerous dependence on any single superpower. A Canadian farmer could sell wheat to Indonesia. An Australian tech firm could partner with South Korea. A Mexican manufacturer could access markets in South Africa. This diversified network would act as a shock absorber, protecting each member from economic coercion. If America threatens tariffs on Canadian cars, Canada could pivot more easily to other partners within the network. The threat loses its teeth. This is the grand strategy hidden within the simple invitation from Canberra to Ottawa. The parliamentary address is the glamorous tip of the spear. The hard practical work is the economic and strategic integration happening beneath the surface. The critics will say this is naive. They will argue that coordinating 50 nations with different cultures, economies, and political systems is a fantasy. They will point to the overwhelming military and economic might of the United States and ask, how can a club of middle powers hope to stand up to that? The answer lies not in direct confrontation, but in creating options. This is not about defeating America or China. It is about escaping the trap of absolute dependency on them. For Canada, the peril of dependency is stark. For over 3/4 of its history, more than 75% of all Canadian exports went to a single customer, the United States. That number has only recently dipped, thanks to painful effort, to around 67%. That is still a terrifying level of exposure. It means American politicians can, with a single policy change, threaten millions of Canadian jobs. It is an existential vulnerability. For Australia, the dependency is different but just as acute. An overwhelming reliance on selling raw materials to China, making its economy a hostage to Beijing's political whims. Carney's mission, and now Albanese's, is to build fire escapes. The Australia partnership is the first. It will not replace the massive trade with America overnight, but it doesn't have to. It just has to be credible and growing. Its very existence changes the psychological and strategic game. When Trump's officials threaten Canada, they can no longer be sure Canada will flinch, because Canadian officials can now look south and say, we are deepening ties with Australia, Mexico, and others. Your leverage is not what it was. Of course, this bold international gambit carries domestic risks for Carney. Some in Canada will ask why their prime minister is jetting off to address foreign parliaments when there are pressing issues at home. This is a fair political concern. The answer is that in the 21st century, domestic prosperity and international strategy are inextricably linked. Canada's ability to protect jobs, grow its critical minerals sector, and keep its economy stable is directly tied to its success in building alternatives to the American market. The partnership with Australia is not diplomacy for its own sake. It is an economic development strategy. That Australian parliamentary speech is, in effect, a high-stakes sales pitch and alliance-building mission that, if successful, will mean more investment, more trade, and more security for Canadian workers. The international work is domestic policy conducted on a global stage. The world is now watching March 2026 with intense interest. Carney's address to the Australian Parliament will be one of the most scrutinized speeches of the year. Every word, every nuance will be analyzed in Washington, Beijing, and other middle power capitals. The substance of the talks that follow, the concrete deals on critical minerals, technology sharing, and trade facilitation, will determine whether this is the birth of a new system or a false dawn. We are at a hinge point in history. The post-Cold War era of American-led globalization is over. The new era is defined by fracturing blocks and economic warfare. In such a world, the old strategy for middle powers, huddling close to a great power and hoping for the best, is a recipe for perpetual insecurity. Donald Trump's America has proven itself an unpredictable patron. China offers a different kind of pressure. The middle powers are in the crossfire. Mark Carney looked at this dangerous landscape and proposed a third path, unity. Anthony Albanese heard that proposal and said, "We will walk it with you." This is more than a new friendship. It is the potential first draft of a new world order, one not dominated by two rival superpowers, but shaped by a concert of capable, cooperative nations determined to control their own destinies. The invitation from Australia is the crack in the dam. Now, we wait to see if a flood of change will follow.